Hello everyone and welcome to another vlog. There is a comment that keeps popping. People keep asking me for posting my settings to my photos. So I think if so many people want to know my settings, I think it's worth creating a video on this. So in this video, I'll talk about how I establish settings in a certain location, how I decide for aperture, ISO, and exposure time, and after that, I will talk about why knowing my settings is almost equal to zero. Hello everyone, my name is Toma, Phototome here on YouTube. I'm a full-time landscape and travel photographer, and if you're interested in this kind of topics, make sure to subscribe to this channel. And if you want, you can come to one of my workshops, or you can further support me by buying one of my editing courses. So people want to know what my settings are for different photos. And I think that the best way in which I can explain how I'm thinking about settings is by offering you a visual experience. This is me, and this is the environment that I'm in. And let's assume that I'm having this small foreground element, and after that I'm having this tree in the distance and then the mountains in the background. Now I want to take a photo of this landscape, and let's assume that there is no wind in this equation, because wind and moving elements change the way I approach scene in terms of settings. Now let's assume there is no wind. Now I have a few options. I can use a wide angle lens and include the foreground element plus the tree plus the mountains, and I will have to think about some settings, but then I can use the telephoto and include only the tree with the mountains in the background. If I will use the wide angle lens and include the foreground, then I'll have to make sure that I have a depth of field big enough for me to have a clear scene, a sharp scene. Because if you're using a wide angle lens and you have some elements that are not in sharp, then those elements will occupy a really big area from your photo, and it will look strange, it will look odd. So you need to have the foreground, the middle ground, and the background in sharpness. And this is made by adjusting your aperture. So this is how I'm starting to think about my scene. Now, depending how close I want to be from the foreground element, I have to decide on a certain aperture, and I'll have to take into account the focal length that I'm using and also the camera, if it's a full frame or a crop sensor. Now, let's assume it's a full frame, and let's assume it's a 17mm. Now, there are some charts with the hyperfocal distance, and the hyperfocal distance, the smallest aperture that you can set in order to have a depth of field starting at a certain point and ending to infinity. This is how you can look very simply to the hyperfocal distance. Usually in landscape photography, we use apertures of f8, f11, f16, the reason is very simple. The more you close your aperture, the bigger the depth of field is. Now I tend to use the 17mm lens, and I tend to stay at about 2 meters or 1.5 meters from the foreground element. So setting an f to be f8 or f11, it's more than enough to have a sharp image and to have a depth of field big enough to have all the elements in sharpness. I prefer f11 for the 17 to 40mm lens and f8 to my 24 to 105mm lens. I noticed that these lenses are sharpest at these particular apertures. So I'm shooting with the 17mm lens, I'm using f11. I'm setting my camera on a tripod, so my ISO is 100. There is no wind, so I can afford to have any exposure time. So I'm just adjusting the exposure time. It doesn't matter to me what exposure time I'm getting. It may be 1 second, 2 seconds, 30th of a second. It really doesn't matter. I press the shutter, I do the photo. Now let's think about the scene if there is wind in the scene. Now, if there is wind in the scene and the branches of the tree are moving, then I will have two options. I either froze the motion of the leaves, or I capture the motion of the leaves and branches. Now let's assume that I want to freeze the motion of the leaves. I don't want to see them moving around. The F will still have to be at f11 because I want that big depth of field. But if the exposure time goes, let's say, 1/10 of a second, that exposure time will not be short enough to capture the branches still. So I will need to increase the ISO. I will have to go to ISO 320, 640, and usually I stop at around 800 ISO. I don't want to go higher than that, but if the situation demands it, you'll have to go higher with the ISO. So I'm going with a higher ISO, and then I adjust the exposure time. And when I get, let's say, 200th of a second or 250th of a second, I can try and do the photo. You can also try lowering the exposure time and see. Depends on how strong the wind is. Now, if you want to capture the movement and have that blurry movement in the branches of the tree, then keep the ISO 100 f11 and the exposure time go with 1/10 of a second or 1 second, or maybe you will need to increase furthermore the aperture and go probably f22 to go with an exposure time that is more longer. Now let's assume you have a telephoto lens. If you use a telephoto lens, then your tree will be big in the subject, in the frame. This means the tree has to be in sharp. Now usually an f4, f5.6, f6.3 will be more than enough. Now if you want to also have the background in sharpness, then you'll have to again close the aperture some more, consult the hyperfocal distance, and evaluate your distance from the tree, evaluate what aperture, look at the focal length, and try to adjust it. Now let me explain why this means nothing to you. This is irrelevant, and you should not concentrate on knowing the settings for any photo. The settings that I'm using are specific to a certain location, a certain type of light, and my own desire, the thing that I wanted to get in that photo. A bigger depth of field, a smaller depth of field. Knowing what each element does, it's much more important. If you close your aperture, and this means having higher numbers, f8, f11, f16, the depth of field increases. If you lower the aperture, the depth of field decreases. If you have an exposure time, now if there are elements that don't move in the scene and you are using a tripod, then it doesn't matter your exposure time. If you have elements that move in the scene, then you have to ask yourself, do I want those elements to be captured moving or frozen? And you decide on a certain exposure time. If you have to raise the ISO, then you will generate noise in the photo. But with the new cameras, ISO 640 or ISO 800, it doesn't mean that much. I think this captures everything that I wanted to say about this topic. If you have questions, if you have anything else to say, just use the comment section below. Tell me in comments if you're interested in this service of buying prints, and also in this upcoming book that I'm preparing. I will publish it with blurb, and it's about my foggy forest. It includes a lot of my photos that are related to forest photography. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being a subscriber. Think about joining this community and becoming a subscriber if you're not a subscriber. And until next time, bye bye.